Welcome to another presentation of Curtis Jones writing. Pardon me. I'm reading out of my book Getting There, which has a subtitle of Choices Decides Destinations. And these are stories that are some through family history passed down my grandfather and his brother, Uncle Dick, and others, and some stories that should have gone in Dad's Old Truck 1 or 2, or in Love Endures All Things, one of those three books. But they didn't, so they ended up in this book. And the next story I'll be reading is The Promised Land. It is chapter 11, last chapter in this book. And I'm starting another project when I finish this book. So it may be a little while before I post again. I want to get those projects done, and I think I have 3 other books left to read, plus the 2 books which include Love Endures All Things 1, 2, 3 in one book, and Dad's Old Truck 1 and 2 in another book. So I won't be reading those 2 because I've, in essence, already read them. But I will be pausing for a little while I finish the research and get these next 2 books that I'm trying to write written. And they're both in the vein of a religious book. So when I get them finished, then I will, I don't know if I'll do it on this channel or start another channel where I post my religious books and some of my sermons, because I preach regularly here where I attend worship service and other places. But this chapter 11 is an oral family history passed down, and I did the best I could to write it, describing what it was like to be a Cherokee Indian in Georgia and Alabama before they cast the Indians to Oklahoma and took their land. Of course, I'm only 1/8 Indian, so I wasn't there, but most of the people I write about were there and experienced these things firsthand. So let me get started. As I live in the territory, I began to love the new land. There were few white people here, and we could live free as we once did. We built our homes on land given to us by the United States, and we prospered. The land was granted by the Cherokee Council to each family. We received deeds to the land, and no one could take it from us unless we gave the land to them by our deed. My father traveled to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and took a wife. My mother had died on the Trail of Tears. I had a new mother who was white. She married my father because he had land. Many of the people went to Arkansas or Kansas to get a wife. Many women died on the journey. My father's new wife became the mother of 5 children. My father was happy for the first time since my mother had died. My mother's name was Elizabeth Dancing Water Tenkiller. I still miss her. My new mother's name was Mary Martin, now Mary Tenkiller. Mary had no Indian name, so we called her Mary Green Eyes Tenkiller. When we address each other, we use only our tribal names, but for the white people, we use our Christian name. Green Eyes had a hard time getting used to being called by her tribal name, but she still fit into the tribe, and we loved her as we did our own mother. She made our father happy. We have settled down to a calm and predictable life in the territory. Our home is growing into a comfortable and well organized farm. We raise most of the food we eat and hunt for the meat that we need. We dry and preserve as much as we can, and we sell what is extra to people in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Green Eyes had learned how to cook the food we love, and we have learned to like some of the food she likes. She worked as hard as any man, and the homestead looked better all the time. Our farm is located in a small community called Nycut. We have 360 acres on the edge of Little Lees Creek. A stagecoach line runs through the creek and goes from Salisaw Trading Post to Stillwell. That is where the railroad crosses the country. Fort Smith is a day's journey from here by wagon. It only takes 6 hours if you travel by horse. To make ends meet, we must cut and sell shakes for roofing houses in Fort Smith. When we have a load on our wagon, we take them to Fort Smith. We also cut railroad ties out of the timber on our property and haul them to Stillwell to the railhead. The trees here are large and have never been harvested. They look, they are good timber. We are able to cut one load of ties a week to take to Stillwell. We get 25 cents for each tie, and our heavy wagon can carry 24 ties. That pays $6 a week for the ties. We can make $5 every 2 weeks from our shingles. We are not able to work in the spring because of the planting of crops. We could not haul the ties or the shingles because the creek gets too big, too deep. We often sit down by the creek as it begins to rise and watch what waters washes down from the folks upstream. We have seen whole wagons come down the creek and break up on the rocks. I also go through the woods looking for raccoons and their pelts. Those folks in Fort Smith pay $1 for a coon pelt. Beaver pelts can fetch 75 cents. So I hunt for beavers too. We don't bother the beavers that are upstream from us because they build dams that help water the animals. My father had given me 30 acres down by the creek to build me a house. I am 16 and I will soon take a wife. I have already begun building my house. I use logs and cut shakes from the old oak trees in the old growth forest in which we live. These trees have almost no knots, and that shakes for shingles are perfect every time. I have learned from my father how to build a house and set it up before you take a wife. Each of our neighbors are almost a mile away, but when you need help, all of your neighbors come to your aid. My best friend, Johnny Eagle Walks, lives up the draw about 3 miles, and we spend as much time together as we can. We like to hunt rattlesnakes, and we take them to where the outlaws always come, and we release them there. It scares the outlaws away, and it makes, excuse me, that required attention. There we go. It scares the outlaws away, and it makes our country safe. The outlaws are white men who don't care about others. Outlaws come here because white men's laws do not apply here. There was one white man that bought a small piece of land on the stagecoach trail from one of our neighbors. He built a trading post where we could get some supplies, and things we could not make ourselves were there and available. His trading post is called High Lonesome Store. His wife gave the trading post that name. His life is hard without much money, but we still develop a thriving economy using trade and barter to get the things we need. We use very little cash because we have very little cash. When we butcher a hog in the fall, we would pay much of what we owed to the trading post with fresh meat. In the summer, we traded produce for parts of our bill. High Lonesome would let us change or charge what we needed, but they expected us to pay it back before the year was over. On the farm, we worked very hard most of the time. We did, however, have weeks where we had time away from our labors and we could carve and make our furniture in those times. That is usually where we would make some of the Christmas gifts we would be giving to each other. I did most of my growing up in the Indian Territory and thought it might sound and though it might sound difficult for you, I enjoyed life here. It was less complicated and more open. We had a smokehouse out back, and much of the meat, especially when the weather was cooler, the rest of the meat we would dry so that it would last until spring. That is when we would once again have to hunt for fresh meat. I hunted with a bow as well as with a musket. We had only one musket, and the powder and the ball were very expensive. That's why I used a bow. I already knew how to make arrows, and I could retrieve most of them as I hunted. Unless they were broken, I could reuse them over and over. Once a bullet is spent, it was gone forever. On one of my hunting trips, I met another man who was from the north and west of here. Stillwell was 18 miles north and west of where I lived. 18 miles north and west of Stillwell was a community called Hungry Mountain. I had heard of it, but never been there. That is where he came from. Many of the tribes had settled in that community, and the wild game had become scarce. They had to travel far to find food. So he and I sat and talked for hours, and when evening was upon us, we made camp and spent the night talking. I knew all about his family, and he knew all about my family by the time the sun came up. It was a very good night. He was called Ben Johnson, and he and I became inseparable. The nation was getting ready to go to war with itself over the slaves that many held, and many thought it unchristian. Having come from the South, I knew it was just economics and had little to do with Christianity. That was long away. That was a long way away. And we were isolated where we now live. The atmosphere seemed very dangerous to both Ben and myself. Everyone began to talk or call us Bob and Ben, the two bad boys. There was little mischief that we could not get into. We spent as much time at my house as his. I found one of his sisters to my liking, and he liked one of my sisters. I had decided I would marry his sister one day, but we were distracted by the war and the talk of war. It was sure to break out in fighting. We were in our 20s when the Great War began, and we both went to fight for the South. We were from the South and felt a kinship to the South because the North had been the one that took our homes, and we both remembered that. It was long it was a long way to where we could sign up to fight, and we had to ride our pintos across much of the territory and volunteer in Louisiana. We did not realize you would have to give up your horses, but they told us we could not keep them when we joined up. White men fight strange. We sold our horses, much to our great disappointment. A Cherokee warrior rode his horse into battle. We would have to walk into battle now. We were both given muskets and put in a sharpshooting company. That meant we were on the front lines at every battle. There were many in the company that had brought their own wives and even their slaves to do work while we were not in battle. I would sometimes sit with Ben and we would watch as the families settled down for the evening around their wagons. They would travel behind our company, and their wagons and wives and children and slaves followed the troops as we moved. We would camp for many weeks in some spots, and sometimes we would move every day or two. After 3 years of war, Ben was shot in the chest and died from his wound. I became so upset that I left the service and started for home. I guess I became a deserter. I would have to walk from Tennessee back to the territory, which was about 600 miles. I knew that if I were caught, I would be shot after a quick court martial. I have to get away as far as I could before they began to look for me. One thing in my favor is that we had won or had worn out our uniforms long ago, so I was dressed in everyday clothes and not a uniform. I was just outside a small town that had a stockyard, and there were horses in the pen. I stood there for a long while studying the animals and deciding which would be the best for the trip back to the territory. The owner became suspicious and came to ask who I was and if he could help me. I told him I was Bob Tenkiller and asked how much for the mare with the blaze on her face. He told me the horse was $12 and he would give me a bill of sale if I wanted her. I told him I would be back as soon as I've raised enough money to buy her. However, I went to the edge of the woods just outside and waited for nightfall to cover my actions. I had decided that I would steal the mare. I went to a farmhouse half a mile down the road and stole the saddle and bridle from their barn. I came back to the ravine. I waited until almost all the lights were turned off before I snuck to the barn and threw a rope around the neck of that sweet horse. She was very calm and quiet as I led her back to the ravine. I put the bridle on the mare and tied her to a branch as I put the saddle on. As soon as she was saddled up, I untied her and jumped on her. She was well broke and did not even react to my climbing aboard. I quickly rode around the outskirts of the village and headed straight for Indian Territory. While I was riding that night, I had lots of time to think about what had happened to me in the last 3 years. I made the decision that night to change my name to Ben Johnson and claim that name as my own. I knew I had given my rightful name to the man at the stockyard. They would be looking for him as a horse thief. I could not continue with that name, or I would be caught and I would be hung. Now I had not only deserted my station, but I have stolen a horse, and that would mean the death penalty. I traveled mostly by night and on out of the way roads or through the woods. It would take me over a month to get to the territory. Even at this, I would have to live somewhere else, or I might be found out and die. I would not give up the grief or the girl that I had come to love, Ben's sister, Maggie May. The thought of her kept me going through all of the battles. And now, in this, my darkest hour, I would sleep in the daytime while everyone was out and about, and I dreamed about my Maggie May. I had written her letters every month for the past 3 years, and she had written me back. I kept all those letters, and they were with me in my kit back at the Army campsite. I would never go back to the Army base to retrieve her letters. I crossed the mighty Mississippi River on a riverboat and went downstream 7 miles. When I crossed another river a little further south, there was still some fighting happening there. That worried me terribly, and I have to be very careful. So I traveled in the early mornings and at dusk only. It was the hardest time to see anything that was going on around you. I wasn't sure where any of the soldiers would be, the Yankees or the Confederates. I did not want to be captured by either one. I knew those hours would be the safest hours for me to travel. After several days traveling through the woods and swamps, I crossed over the state line of Texas. I was just south of the town of Texarkana, and I traveled north to the Red River. I knew I would be safe traveling from there home. I only spent a few days at home. I told my family what I had done. I asked them to not let anyone know that I was back. I told the whole story of what had happened and how I found my way back home. I told my father of my plans to marry Maggie May and would not live there for several years. I wanted to wait until I was sure it would be safe, is what I told them. And I told him what my new name was, that I was Ben Johnson from now on. I told my father I did not know what or where I would be go from there. On the fourth day home, I got up early in the morning and I traded the mare to my father for one of the draft horses. I headed out to Hungry Mountain so I could marry Maggie May. It was a day's travel from Nycut to Hungry Mountain. I camped near Maggie's home until the morning came. We had a lot to talk about before I asked her to accompany me away from all she knew. I found Maggie May at home and we sat and talked for most of that day. I told her how her brother Ben had died and of all the many battles we had fought in side by side. I told her of my escape from the army and how I had taken a horse from Tennessee. I told her that I had changed my name to Ben Johnson. I then asked for her hand in marriage. She agreed, and we were wed that evening by a traveling preacher that was preaching just a mile away. I bought an old farm, or I bought an old tent that the preacher had for a little of nothing, which is all I had. Maggie and I headed for a little place near a town called Atoka. It was a nice place. Atoka was near Fort McAllister in the territory. There was a nice little creek that quietly ran across the property called Muddy Boggy. We set the tent up by that creek, and I set out to build our homestead right there. I used a draft horse to build us a 2-room log cabin, and by winter we were snug in our own little haven of rest. Maggie knew how to make clothes from skins and how to weave things from natural fibers. She was the best cook I had ever found. I went about digging out the tree stumps that were left from building the cabin. That created a field I could use to grow crops for sale. I picked up where I had left off in Nycut before the war, and I was able to build our furniture and even sell some furniture to neighbors. I trapped for furs, and I sold them to the trading post at Fort McAllister. Within 5 years, we were doing well, and we had started a family of our own. One of my neighbors wanted to trade a team of mules for my big draft horse, and we traded. He said had said he had a hard time making these mules work as a team. He said the smaller of the two would balk from time to time, and he didn't know how to overcome that problem. I know an old mule skinner that taught me a trick or two. This pair of mules could easily outwork my draft horse, and I was glad for the trade. Where we lived, there where wild ponies ran through the countryside. And if you could catch one, it was yours. The ponies were high spirited, and every morning when you wanted to ride one, you had to let it buck until it was tired. That was tedious, but the horse was free. Once the horse was tired from bucking you, all the rest of the day he would be calm and gentle. But the next morning it was the same thing again. A riding pony could not plow and would not pull a wagon. We needed the mules to do what must be done on a farm. The first day I tried to plow with the mules, the little one balked and would not pull. I walked to the front of her and I began to twist her ear into the shape of a little tight ribbon. As I pulled on her ear, she began to walk alongside her partner. This worked several times until one day she wouldn't budge even with the ear twisting. That's when I remembered the old mule skinner having a bit, having to, I'm sorry, I remember the old mule skinner having to bite the ear on one mule to overcome its stubborn streak. I twisted the ear until I thought it would come out of by the roots. Then I bit down on it and started walking backwards until the pressure became great and the mule gave way and teamed up with the other. The big mule was called Big Red, and the little stubborn mule was called Little Red. After Little Red learned what my teeth could be used for, she became a good teammate. On occasion, she would act up, and I would walk in front of her and click my teeth together so she could see me. When I did that, it made the sound of bone against bone, and she would relent her stubborn streak and pull wide alongside the Red. This trick that I learned from the old mule skinner in the army, I passed along to my son when they were old enough to understand. I told them it was a good way to overcome a stubborn mule or a wicked wife. Although I would never use this tactic on my dear Maggie May, but I did know what kind of wives my sons might end up with. I had 4 sons and 5 daughters in my long life. I have taught them the knowledge that has been hard won, and I hope that they fare better than I did. I had a good life with Maggie May, but by my side, and all the difficulties were forgotten when we were in each other's arms. Maggie was a woman who taught our children of the might of God in heaven. Maggie's father was a foursquare preacher. My people called them holy rollers, but their hearts were humble and they do seek God. My children have a good understanding of the Bible and what it says. Maggie made them to memorize much of the scriptures. She leaned upon the Bible when hard times came upon us. Things like the death of 2 children from disease, hunger in the lean months, and sadness from family members' deaths. We suffered the loss of her mother and her father the same night in a house fire, And when word came to Maggie of these deaths, it nearly broke her heart. But Maggie taught our children to rely upon the word in the Bible to find comfort and strength in times of trouble. And Maggie did that as well herself. A good woman is the true backbone of a solid and loving family. She is the glue that holds all things together. May God bless you with a good woman. I hope you've enjoyed this story. Uh, this may be the last posting I make for a little while. I need to get these other projects going and ready and get them to my editor so it makes me look like I know what I'm doing. Another good woman. God bless you. Take care and review some of these stories that I've posted. I think I've got over 60 or 70 hours of posts on YouTube on my channel. And I think you'll enjoy them and tell your friends about them. Hit the like button, subscribe so when I start posting again, you will be notified. God bless you and keep you, and may you ever be under his care. Bye bye.